This is literally the strongest build I have ever played, because it's a strength stacker. It is a strength stacking dual strike of ambidexterity juggernaut, and it is pretty good. It's not the cheapest, not the absolute smoothest or best all-around build I've ever played, but it can do this. That is an Uber Cirrus, and I am breaking in between my fingers like a toothpick. Hi, it's Larold, and I'm going to talk about my version of a dual strike juggernaut, aka the strongest man in Wraeclast. But first, I looked it up recently, and over 69% of our viewers aren't subscribed, which is nice, but also not ideal. So don't forget to like the video and subscribe if you haven't already. It helps the channel grow, and it makes us feel nice. Okay, so let's just start with the basics of the build. Why play this instead of something else? I usually do play anything other than melee, and I wanted to do something different. I haven't actually played a melee build in years, I think. I've done league start practice as Bone Shatter over the last couple of leagues, and then decided not to play it during the league. I think that I might actually have to go as far back as Blight to find a league that I actually played melee into the end game and did content and killed bosses with it. This is also a build I've been interested in playing for a really long time, and I just had never bothered to pull the trigger because I had some misgivings about melee. It is melee. I was told melee's unplayable and dead and too inconvenient and irritating, and it turns out none of those are true. Melee is strong. You hit like a bus. Dropping totems and maintaining buffs seems annoying, but really that's only an issue in theory. I think it's basically only something I do against tier 16 map bosses if I want to laugh at how quickly they die, instantaneously instead of very fast, or against major enemies like tier 17 map bosses and uber bosses. What I think really makes this build so special is that it does so much damage. It really is that simple. It is crazy how hard this build hits, even without those totems and so on up. But with them up, I mean, it really goes to the moon. Virtually every build I ever play has great clear speed, good defenses, good utility, good smoothness, whatever, but very few of them just actually hit insanely hard in single target, and this build does that. I will regularly run up to enemies who have Soul Eater or Chaos and Withered Resistance, some sort of thing that for a normal build would make you kind of take a while, and I will just knock them out in 2 hits like I'm Mike Tyson. So now let's take a look at what makes this build work. We're using Dual Strike, and specifically we're using Dual Strike of Ambidexterity. Now, regular Dual Strike is basically just a glorified auto attack. It's an auto attack that you can link supports to, and we're using the transfigured version, Dual Strike of Ambidexterity, which is actually quite a bit more fancy. It doesn't have any good MTX. That is probably the biggest downside to this entire build. Your main attack does not have any sort of fancy appearance at all. It does have the fun little tink 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 sound. I'll throw some of that in. But that is probably the biggest downside I have with this build. It's just no fun visual component to the Dual Strike itself. Now, Dual Strike of Ambidexterity uses your main hand damage. Technically, it gives you 70% more main hand damage, but then it uses your offhand weapon's attack time. And so we're able to kind of game that and kind of get a little fancy with it by having just an insanely hard-hitting main hand, super slow main hand, and then a very, very fast offhand. Now, your weapons do need to be different types, as you can see from the second line in the tooltip of Dual Strike of Ambidexterity. You have to be using 2 different weapon types, so you can't just use a Paradoxica and then a super fast jeweled foil. You have to use a Paradoxica and a claw, or this is kind of the very fancy in-game crafted item. You can just use a Bright Beak, which costs 1 chaos, and you can use that for a while. And I do mean clearing Uber bosses, doing tier 17s kind of a while. I have this fancy corrupted one that I bought. It is very slightly better than a 1 chaos one that wasn't corrupted. You could buy one that is 1 chaos, and as you can see from the rolls on Bright Beak, the crit chance, the attack speed, those don't change. The only thing that you're actually looking for is just good rolls on resistances, which also kind of helps with early gearing. And then if you wanted to put a harvest enchant on it for more attack speed, and maybe try to corrupt it and either get a good corruption or even just corrupt it and then try to use these bad boys, Tainted Blacksmith's Whetstones, to roll it to at least 24% quality, so you get a little bit more attack speed out of the enchant. that is something you could do that would be very, very cheap and really get you up and running in a big bad way for almost no budget at all. Now let's take a look at kind of the mandatory uniques, and I think the only really mandatory one is the Replica Alberon's Warpath. The final line here is basically everything that's important about this pair of boots. It adds 1 to 80 chaos damage to attacks per 80 strength. Then the line right above it, you can't deal any non-chaos damage. It makes it so that all of your damage is chaos, which is good. No reflection. Everything is chaos. Everything is kind of structured around 80 strength breakpoints though as well. So you really want to make sure that you're getting up and over each 80 strength breakpoint. So, you know, like 799 strength is worth substantially less than 801 strength. You know, that +2 strength is not going to be like 0.5% more damage. It's going to be like 6 or 7% more damage. We can kind of see that reflected in some of the passive trees as we'll look at that later on. Now you do have one variable on these, and these come from Heist. They're a little expensive because, you know, they are such a powerful unique, such a like build enabling unique. But there's only really one valuable modifier on here that you care about the roll, and that's the top one, the increased strength. I bought these with a low roll and just rolled them up with divines to get that 18%. Getting one that is an actual good roll is probably going to make it go from like, you know, at this point in the league, prices are very subject to fluctuation because the league is pretty late and the supply is fairly low. So you could go anywhere from like 10 to 20 divines going from a bad roll to a good roll. I think it's probably better to buy one and roll it yourself, but there's always some RNG involved. Now we have another unique in here that I would say isn't quite mandatory. You can definitely use a rare chest, and tankier versions of this build will use a rare chest, but they lose a lot of damage. And that other unique here is the Iron Fortress, this chest, which I have bought a corrupted one with the 50% reduced extra damage from crits. Without that, you know, without any corruptions on it, this is a super common, super cheap, unique chest. And with corruptions, it's a little bit more expensive, but you can buy one that's not 6-linked, is corrupted, and then use tainted fusing orbs and, you know, tainted jeweler's orbs to get that up to 6-link pretty cheaply, pretty easily, and, you know, give yourself a really like just basically best in slot chest for fairly cheap. And I really do like that reduced extra damage from crits. That's always a personal favorite corrupted body armor modifier if you can get it. Now the value of the Iron Fortress really just boils down to it gives you a ton of strength, as you can see from about halfway through the tooltip there. It also gives you a bunch of block chance. As you can see, I have like 48% chance to block, and I think like 33% of that is just coming from the Iron Fortress. And then finally, it gives you strength damage bonuses increased to 3% increased melee physical damage per 10 strength, as opposed to the standard, which is 1% every 5 strength. So again, you have some 10-point breakpoints, but really you're more worried about the 80-point breakpoints. That really matters a lot more. Now you'll note that that says melee physical damage. The standard strength bonus is melee physical damage. Obviously, you're not doing any melee physical damage. You're doing melee chaos damage. And so what we're able to do is we're able to make use of Iron Will, which changes, or not changes, but makes your strength damage bonus apply to all spell damage as well. And then we're able to convert that over into damage by, let's see, where do I have my Battle Mage's Cry? Here it is. We're able to convert that spell damage increase back over into non-physical melee damage by using Battle Mage's Cry. And we just hook Battle Mage's Cry up to a call to arms. So it's just chain, it's auto casting. We have that hooked up, and then we are just getting basically like a significant amount of our spell damage, you know, potentially up to 150% of our increases to spell damage are applying to attacks, and our attacks are, you know, they're now suddenly doing a massively increased amount of damage. It's this weird chain where our melee physical damage is increasing our spell damage, which is then increasing our melee chaos damage. But it basically just boils down to you run around and now you're automatically yelling and your auto attacks hit super hard. Or your dual strikes hit super hard anyway. Now there are several other fairly close to mandatory, very good uniques that I wouldn't be without. And those are Paradoxica, just simply because this weapon in your main hand is just super, super valuable with this build. It always does double damage with all of your attacks. This does mean that any sources of like chance to deal double damage will have no effect because you already have 100% from the Paradoxica, but it's basically the best of slot weapon for all melee builds that dual wield or use a sword and shield anyways. Your next unique is Eternal Damnation. This comes from, I'm blanking on the name here, Sanctum. This comes from Sanctum. It is not all that uncommon, really. You know, it's definitely something you can get pretty easily in Trade League. I don't think it drops Corrupted by default. That is definitely something I would warn against, is like, you know, you can buy one that's not corrupted and put Whispers of Doom on it, and that's going to cost 3 gold. Oils, that's going to be cheaper than putting that enchant or that anoint onto a corrupted item where now you have to use tainted oil. I don't know if I have any tainted oil on hand. Oh, I do, but those are worth, at this point in the league, quite a lot. That's like an extra 5 divines, 5 to 7 divines you're going to be paying to anoint a corrupted neck, so bear that in mind when you're buying them. I think I just got this one on kind of a deal. And the only thing that really rolls kind of, you know, whatever, with a big range on it on the Eternal Damnation is the Chaos Res roll. But the way it works is basically it reduces all of your max reses, all of them including Chaos, and then it gives you extra elemental damage reduction equal to half of your Chaos Res. So you have this huge incentive to cap your Chaos Res, and then there's some other stuff you can do elsewhere in the tree, and I'll kind of show that off once we get into the PoB, to raise your resistances back up, and it just gives you a lot of extra cold, lightning, and fire damage reduction that doesn't necessarily show up in the in-game, but does show up in PoB and does make you quite a lot more tanky. It kind of helps compensate for the fact that we are not fully spell suppression capped and we don't have any spell block at all. There are a couple of other uniques that we're going to look at here that I'll just show off if I can find them here. Obviously, this is a strength stacker, so we're going to use split personality. I prefer strength max life. You can do strength and something else. Strength and dexterity is okay, or, you know, if you're trying to get your stats sorted out, strength and accuracy can be okay, but strength max life is definitely going to be the best all around. And then obviously we're going to use like a Watcher's Eye and a Mage Blood, as always, not mandatory, but sure is nice to have. And then if I can find the last thing here, Balance of Terror. There's just one line on this Balance of Terror: inflict withered for 2 seconds on hit if you've cast Despair in the past 10 seconds. It also does give you some Ellie res. I probably should divine that so that it's closer to 15 instead of 10, but whatever. And so the idea here is, you know, because we're doing chaos damage, we are using just occasionally hand casting Despair, because this doesn't, that effect will not work if you are triggering Despair. You do have to actually cast it. But if we cast Despair, now we'll be able to apply Withered on hit, and we're hitting over 10 times a second, so we'll be able to have 15 stacks of Withered pretty much instantly and permanently maintain that, as long as we're permanently maintaining Despair, which is pretty easy to do. Most enemies aren't going to last very long once we have 15 Withered stacks and Despair going. And also, you don't actually have to hit anything with Despair. You can throw Despair on the ground, you know, not necessarily something you want to do. You pretty much always do want to Despair an enemy. Anything you want to do damage to, you're going to want to hit with a Despair, but hypothetically speaking, if something's unattackable, you could throw Despair down and then still attack and be applying those Withereds. It's a possibility. So as for whether this build can be done as a league starter, whether it'll be viable for the next league, you know, you never know what the next league is going to hold. So I can't say that with any absolute certainty, but I do think that this is a build that probably isn't very good as a league starter. It's a stat stacker. It is going to require a lot of uniques, and especially some that, you know, you don't have to use Eternal Damnation. You could use a lot of different other necks. You could just use a rare crafted neck with like a lot of strength and stats on it. That would work. There are definitely some other options as well for necks. I think Defiance of Destiny is something that can work okay. Eternal Damnation is really preferable, primarily because it just increases your ability to take like larger max hits, and that tends to be more likely what will kill you in this particular build than just like lots of small hits, which a Defiance of Destiny is really like more built around living through a bunch of small hits. But that could also work. A lot of options for your neck, right? A lot of options for a lot of these pieces, but Replica Alberon's Warpath being something that's pretty non-negotiable for the build does make it kind of hard to league start. But you can't just league start Bone Shatter Jug, which is without question the best melee league starter in the game, and probably going to remain like a top 3 to 5 league starter going into 3.25, barring any massive changes. You know, it may even go up. If they finally do nerf Detonate Dead, Bone Shatter Jug might actually see a rise in value. And then this would be probably the best second build to switch over to out of Bone Shatter Jug. Play Bone Shatter Jug for a while, get bored of it, switch over to this, kill everything in the game, you know, with ease. So in terms of the content that I've been doing everything. I've been, you know, doing mapping, tier 17s, Probably could do Sanctum. I haven't done any Sanctum. I did a very small amount of delving. I even ran like one heist just to see. I ran a simulacrum when I was still like low 90s, I think, and that went pretty well. It basically can do everything. It isn't really struggling with any content at all, so I've been pretty happy with it on that front. And yeah, I don't really think there's anything that this build can't handle. Now, the budget range in terms of how expensive it is to like set up and get going, I think Replica Alberon's Warpath is going to be kind of the biggest like thing that holds you up initially when you're setting up this build for the first time. It kind of is something that is going to fluctuate from league to league. Early on in a league, this might only be a couple of divines and then spike up after a while. Kind of depends on how much you want to run heist if you want to try and farm it yourself. Obviously, any sort of super unique heavy build like this one is going to be a bit difficult to do as a solo self-found thing or to do in the very early days of a league. So budget is definitely going to depend. And then the high-end potential for the budget is truly infinite. Any sort of stat stacker, you could literally take this build to 50 mirrors if you wanted to, and it would only get stronger the more that you throw at it because of the way that stat stacking works in this game. The more strength you have, the more that every single point of strength that you've added before is worth. And so you could be very realistically sitting on, with a much higher budget that I'm playing with, like over 8k life and doing hundreds of millions of DPS. That would definitely be on the table. All right, so I will talk about the MTX I'm using briefly, since that is something I like to talk about. I really wish that there was like a good white weapon to use. I'm using the black and white body armor. If I turn off my automation support for my molten shell, I'm using black and white armor. I have some fun like flask effects here. I'll turn those all off so that they're not making it quite so hard to see my character. But the black and white armor, I really love the way that this looks, one of my favorites. And then I'm using the black sword, and I wish I could use the white offhand, but the white offhand I think is just a wand, white staff or wand, so that doesn't work. I could use the second black sword, I guess. Well, I couldn't use a black sword. I'd have to use like a black claw or a black mace or something, but anyhow, I've gone with a liege weapon, which I think is an old supporter pack item. It's the closest thing I could get to a white weapon, but black and white set. And then for the dual strike of ambidexterity, there is nothing there. If I look for purchase items for this slot, there is nothing there. It's basically just an auto attack, unfortunately. For auras, just using like black and white auras and stuff. Kind of trying to keep the whole theme of black and white as kind of offhand and main hand. Now I'll run through the skills here, and obviously we have dual strike of ambidexterity. That's the main engine of this build. We are linking it up to void manipulation, just more chaos damage, very basic. Increased crit damage support. This is a crit damage build, and we're getting a lot of crit multi. I have Awaken multi-strike support. I did almost all of the content on this build. As you can see, it's still level 1. I did almost all the content on this build with a regular multi-strike support. I only switched to Awaken multi-strike after playing this for a while and deciding, yeah, I do want to keep playing this more. I'm really having a lot of fun with it. You absolutely do not need Awaken multi-strike support. It is wildly expensive. With that being said, it is also very powerful. I mean, that is the reason it is so expensive. So I did feel like it was worth the investment for me, but I didn't need it to do. I didn't really even need the 6th link to do like tier 17s and certainly like speedy tier 16s and regular pinnacle bosses I could do with a 5 link. But even just like a regular multi-strike support worked for all of the content in the game. Volatility support, just a very, very strong attack damage support, very good to have. And then finally, Ruthless support really works well with multi-strike or Awaken multi-strike, adds a lot more damage. And that's kind of your standard 6 link. Then you have some other stuff going on here. Automation support hooked up to Molten Shell. Some people will do cast when damage taken for that. For one thing that I dislike about that is cast when damage taken has a massive mana multiplier. And so if you're going to do that, there's a very real possibility that you may want to link that up to life tap. You might not have enough unreserved mana. The same can be true for Assassin's Mark and Mark on hit support. You can link that up to life tap if you want. It does require giving up some sockets elsewhere. I prefer just running Molten Shell automation and then just having really about as high of uptime as you possibly can on Molten Shell. I think our cooldown is 4 seconds and our duration is pretty close to 4 seconds. So we're looking around 50% uptime on Molten Shell. I think that's pretty good. Similarly, Battle Mage's Cry and Call to Arms, same exact thing there. And then, as I said, Mark on Hit and Assassin's Mark, we're using crit. We definitely need that Assassin's Mark going on rares and uniques to give us a lot more crit chance, crit multi, and power charges as well. We're actually getting all 3 types of charges from this build, and that is really a big part of why our damage is able to multiply so high, get up over 80 million DPS. It is because of all 3 charges coming into play, and so having Assassin's Mark helps with getting those power charges, as well as just that kind of baseline crit chance. We are using Arrogant Support with Precision. This is pretty common for Juggernaut builds, since this is a Juggernaut build, to use Precision to reserve some life. We have a lot of life. Giving up a couple hundred of that, getting Precision, and getting it with that extra aura effect that you get out of Arrogant Support is, I think, worth it. We're using Blood Rage as well. That's just purely for the attack speed. We're able to leech through that very easily. The attack physical damage leeches life doesn't do anything, because that is only physical damage, but we do get a lot of extra attack speed. Little bit more frenzy charge generation just while clearing, that's okay. And then we have Whirling Blades linked up to faster attacks. That's just our main mobility skill. If you're using a Bright Beak, if you go with Bright Beak instead, I'll slap that in just to show that off here. You'll see it's not working. Whirling Blades isn't working. You have to use Leap Slam instead. Same basic approach though. You just use Leap Slam instead of the Whirling Blades until you've switched over to Sword and Claw. For our next setup here, pretty standard totem 3-link, multiple totem support linked up to the 2 totems, and then you slap those down whenever you're going to kill a boss. You want to do so really fast, you slap those down, then you engage with the boss, hit him with a Despair, and then just get in there and chop him to death, basically. And then our final link here is Determination and Purity of Elements. We're getting Determ, we're getting Purity of Elements. Those are pretty standard defensive auras. They make it so that we're able to deal with all ailments. Helps with resistances a lot. Since we are wearing a lot of uniques, we're not getting a ton of resistances. That's pretty helpful. And then Determination is Determination. It's more armor, it's flat armor, it's just kind of everything we want in a defensive aura. And then we have Despair, and I've linked that up to faster casting support just to make it a little bit, like you can see, cast speed is like 0.36 without it and 0.27 with it. So it is definitely noticeable. Not mandatory, again, something just like the Assassin's Mark. With Mark on Hit, you can link that up to Life Tap if you feel you need to. You have a couple of bits of wiggle room here in the link setup, like I have a faster attacks and a faster casting that aren't absolutely mandatory that could be dropped if you wanted to move some stuff around. Alright, so I have 2 Atlas passive trees that I'm going to show off here. This is the one I started with. I'll call it right tree, and then I have the left tree, which you've kind of already seen a little bit of. That's the one I'm currently using. I'll explain why I made the transition. But as you can see with this one, with the gear that I had, I was around 50 to 55 million DPS in this setup, fully buffed. We're talking full withered stacks applied, all 3 types of power charges, frenzy charges, and endurance charges active, potion active, bottled faith active, everything rocking and rolling, fully stacked, fully charged up, totems down, 50 to 55 million DPS, feeling pretty decent about that. And as you can see, this is a split personality setup, so we're coming down here and we're wiggling around and we're putting a Lethal Pride here, and you'll definitely want to use the Find Timeless Jewel calculator and try and find yourself a good Timeless Jewel to put here. And that is the reason that I'm come down and taking Destroyer, which obviously is worthless other than the fact that it gives 5% increased strength, but as you can see, I'm over that 1520 strength breakpoint, and if I drop Destroyer, I drop down to 1480, so that point there is 7.5% more damage because of that, so that is why I'm taking this one weird point here in this setup. Your mileage will vary based on your Lethal Pride. Like, I would much rather come take Dervish, since it is a much better underlying skill. But, it's gonna leave me under the strength breakpoint and actually be weaker for damage output. Like, if, we can just look right here. I swap these out, 54.37. I swap to this, 54.679. Better to go with Destroyer. So that is also the reason that I have Vigor here. I have this melee crit multi-value out of that. It's nice to get an extra endurance charge, but it's not really mandatory. But as you can see, that's like close to 2 million DPS. It's pretty good. Now you have a couple of ways of generating frenzy charges on single target. You can do that basically, there are 2 main ways. you can either come through this here, which these 2 flask charges against marked enemy are basically dead nodes, but then you get Culling Strike against marked enemies, which is pretty good, 10% more damage. And then you can get this Mark Mastery that gives you a 10% chance to get a Frenzy Charge when you hit your marked enemy. This will help you maintain Frenzy Charges in single target. You know, you can see our attack speed is over 11 attacks per second, so that means you're generating over 1 Frenzy Charge per second. You're never having any problems with maintaining that, just like you never have any problems with maintaining anything that's based on hitting enemies. We're also taking this little node right here, Life and Mana Leech, just to give ourselves some life and mana leech, and that makes it a lot easier pressure-wise on our cluster jewels. We don't have to get any life or mana leech from our cluster jewels, and that's why we're doing that. And then we're also taking beef, again, just because it gets us over that 15-20 strength break point. It is actually like a 7% damage increase to take this stupid strength node. That's just the life of a strength stacker. Now, the reason that I'm over here on this right-hand side of the tree mainly is to take the spell suppression mastery. Get these 2 points in spell suppression. At the time, I was wearing 2 pieces of spell suppression gear, so with the lucky spell suppress and all of that, I would be around 60-something% spell suppression, and then my dex requirement is entirely based off of the Paradoxica, so I'm at 251. I could drop down to 221, I suppose. I could basically just throw tattoos in a lot of these dex nodes, 3 of these dex nodes for 2% more suppression, and get myself up into the like 80 suppress range, which, you know, 80 suppress, people kind of have this tendency to be like 100% or nothing. That's not really true, especially when you are wearing a neck like Eternal Damnation. You're getting all of this extra damage reduction anyway. I think that all works really well. I ultimately opted out of coming to this right-hand side of the tree for a very simple reason. I found I was able to get a lot more damage by coming up to the left-hand side of the tree and having a much, much longer path to my split personality jewels. And so I'm going to show that off now. Now, the downside here, as you can see, like, effective hit pool is definitely something that's a little overrated, but max hit definitely is like, you know, that's kind of legitimate. And so if we show off the left-hand side of the tree, my Chaos max hit goes up since I have more life on this side of the tree, but we can just look. Fizz max hit also goes up, but Elemental max hit has gone down as we switch over to the left-hand tree, and that's because I'm no longer able to come over and take Prismatic Skin and Soul of Steel. This is something at a high budget you could fix. You could take, what is it called, an Impossible Escape that's either around Unwavering Stance or Unbalanced Guard, and pick up Soul of Steel and Prismatic Skin. That way you'd have to lose one of your rare jewels in the tree in order to get that. But as you can see, just to look at kind of the pathing, we're doing a big loop-de-loop all the way around, and then we got this spaghetti twirling around here, and we're coming all the way up, and around, and our longest split personality node is 57 places away from the starting point, which, just to compare that to the other tree, I think the furthest one was like 39. Yeah, so like substantially more strength and dex coming in from this tree at the expense of some defensive value. And you can see we jump from, just to compare those two trees again, 1538 to 1684 on the strength, and that's pretty significant. Now, I have made a couple of changes. I could fit in a couple of dexterity tattoos, like, you know, I only need 211 or 212, so I could actually fit in 3 here. I could bring myself down to 216. I haven't decided what I would want to do. I think the dexterity tattoo spots would be right in this area over here. That is kind of why I came over this way, is initially I was having a little bit of trouble making it work with dexterity, and, you know, coming this way instead of coming this way through the strength, this does give you a little bit more pathing around the side. So I did feel that I got a bit more stat budget, even though I did waste, technically I waste a point of travel over this way. I thought it was worth it at the time anyways. Maybe that's an optimization I could make, but I could fix some of these tattoos either to do suppression, although I have very, very little suppression, just one piece of gear with suppression on it now. Potentially I could do Ramako Archer tattoos, 5% global accuracy rating. If we look at our damage, 83 million, 58,000. If we slap that in, it's about 150,000 DPS out of each of those tattoos. So 3 of those for like close to 500,000. That's not too bad. That's definitely a possibility. Now, because I'm not able to reach over here and get the life and mana leech node, I am unfortunately required to fix that through cluster jewels, and I should probably talk about cluster jewels now. There's one node that you absolutely want to get on all of your cluster jewels, and that's this right here, Quick and Deadly. It makes it so that you get massively increased damage you know, on your main hand and massively increased attack speed on your offhand, and that perfectly synergizes with Dual Strike of Ambidexterity, and so you're going to want that on both of your cluster jewels. And then for the other ones, you basically have to get Feed the Fury on one of them, because Feed the Fury is a prefix, and that gives you your Life Leech, and so that'll take care of Life Leech. You're able to have Life Leech and be able to sustain through content. And then for the other one, you're going to have to get Fuel the Fight on it. It doesn't really matter which one has which, but Fuel the Fight will give you Mana Leech, and that'll make it so that you're able to sustain mana, but you do need both of those on your cluster jewels. And then for the one that you're not putting split personalities into, you know, I like, whenever I'm doing split personality builds, I like to just have 2 notables and then have like all stats on the cluster jewels, so that I can just kind of do the wraparound here and make one of the points be, you know, a bit longer away from the starting point than the other one. But for standard cluster jewel, obviously you want to do 3 notables, and then you can go with basically any of the suffix. Notables are fine. We can actually just show this off here. This is how I evaluate cluster jewels, generally speaking. Type U, and then large cluster jewel. All right, and we're looking for attack damage while dual wielding. And so the way that we look at these is I just open it up and I just look at the prefixes and just see like the 3% more effective hit pool, 2% more damage. That's not very good. 1.5% more damage. That's not very good. 6% more damage. That is pretty good. 3% more damage. That's okay. You know, none of these are really that good. And then you look at quick and deadly and it's over 10% more DPS. Obviously, that's insane. Now, then we look at the suffixes, and you can see that Heavy Hitter, really not that great. Martial Prowess, that is pretty great. And Smite the Weak, because it only works on enemies that are maimed, the way that you would want to evaluate this is you would want to put this in, then, like, you know, set up a cluster jewel that has it in, then put it in, take the point, and then come to your config tab and look for, is the enemy maimed, which will then show up in this area here. And then you would go back and look at the cluster jewel again and see like how much, or you could just, I guess, just look at it in the passive tree and see how much damage it is actually adding. But I can say, from having already done that previously, it's a little bit weaker than Martial Prowess. It's like 3.5% more damage. So better than Heavy Hitter, worse than Martial Prowess. Martial Prowess is technically the best. All right, one thing I haven't actually mentioned yet is the Watcher's Eye I'm using. I'm just using a Chaos Res while affected by Purity of Elements Watcher's Eye. This is not the like perfect ideal one. Obviously something with precision, increased attack speed or damage, or even just, you know, crit chance or crit multi or whatever. Just some sort of precision jewel would be ideal. But I needed this to get Chaos Res capped. Ideally, I would have just a very, very sexy ring that had a bunch of Chaos Res on it, and then I could use Kalandra's Reflection, whatever it's called, the ring that mirrors your other ring. Like, I would use that, but I just don't really have that great of rings right now, and so I'm not in that position. You know, that really elevates the budget by like a pretty substantial amount. So that would be what I would do with my Watcher's Eye ideally, but we're just not doing that yet. All right, so just to mention some of the kind of notable skills in the passive tree, I've already mentioned Iron Will. I've already mentioned that Lethal Pride is kind of valuable in this area. It just adds a massive amount of strength. You know, you do want to come down and take Panopticon. That really does make your totems add just a massive amount of damage. Even though totems are kind of lame, like I do think they're lame, they're only something that you use on bosses. And, you know, for those, like having a button that you can press instead of an attack that makes all of your attacks do like 25% more damage or 30% more damage or whatever is pretty crazy, and it definitely is worth it. And, you know, I will just say, like, if I just buff up real quick here and just kind of show off, I think you can see, like, this is my standard auto attack speed. Yeah, it's pretty fast. In fact, I'll turn on sound so you can hear it. Pretty fast. All right, now let's drop totems. The difference is absurd, right? Like, I just hit so much harder and faster with totems active, with Blood Rage active, and, you know, with withering everything. You really do hit like just massively more damage. So ultimately, you know, I do think it's worth it. It's worth coming down and taking Panopticon. This is kind of hidden a little bit by the Lethal Pride effect here, but Totem Mastery that makes your totem buffs linger for 3 seconds after the totems despawn or you move out of range or whatever. That's just like quality of life, not mandatory, but it is pretty cool to have. I mentioned earlier the ability to get frenzy charges from enemies. So the other way to do that is just to take this sword mastery. You know, if you're taking this, If you're taking this cluster over here and getting the chance to get frenzy charges when you hit a marked enemy, then you don't need to double up on that with the sword mastery. And so you can take the crit chance with swords and crit multi minus crit multi with swords instead. That'll give you very close to 100% crit chance. But, you know, I kind of prefer to just have the sword mastery, give yourself frenzy charges when you hit unique enemies, and then any other time you're sustaining frenzy charges just by killing guys. We are taking this crit multi wheel here. It's just really good, adds a lot of damage, and the mastery is good. We are taking attack mastery that makes non-vol strike skills target an additional enemy, and this is why we're able to get away with not using Ancestral Call. I have played around with Ancestral Call instead of Ruthless support in mapping. Like, you know, it has worked some. It's been totally fine. Definitely made it like really, really smooth, clear, but just not something I felt like I absolutely needed. Here are two wheels that I think are pretty interesting. There's this Warcry one, which just makes it so that you really do a lot more damage on enemies that are affected by your Warcries, which is basically all the enemies that you run into. Certainly any like rares, uniques, anything that lasts a little longer, that they're going to take a lot more damage. And then the Warcry buff effect really does do a lot more to convert that strength into physical damage, convert that physical damage into spell damage, convert that spell damage back into regular melee damage. So it just adds a little bit more juice into that. And then I really like the Warcry mastery because it makes it so that if for some reason you don't hit anything with your Warcry, you are going to always have, like, you know, if you're moving from pack to pack, you're still going to have some power on that Warcry. You're never going to have your Warcry not be adding damage. Then there's this wheel here that makes it so that you get Fortify. From the mastery, all of your melee hits will fortify. You are -3 on your max fortification, but the notable here gives you +3 on max fortification. So you're basically always going to be sitting at 21 fortify all the time. And then having the increased duration is actually way more valuable than having more stacks of it. 2% more damage reduction from hits is not as valuable as just permanent uptime on fortify, in my opinion. And then I think maybe the last really important thing to point out, I will say I do take this notable here, 30% reduced extra crit damage, or extra damage from crits. I'm also tattooing in place of 2 of my int nodes because I have a decent amount of int. Reduced extra damage from crits. So between the chest, which is 50, and then this notable, which is 30, and the 2 tattoos, which are 5, I'm at 90% reduced damage taken from crits. So I'm almost crit immune. Not quite, but close enough. Because of the 80-point breakpoints for strength, this passive 5 strength per allocated mastery skill can be more valuable than increased attributes. You know, it is something you'll have to kind of evaluate depending on exactly how much strength and everything you have, because it is preferable to get more dex and more int. Definitely helps with gearing if you're able to take increased attributes, but you want to be sure that you're not losing on one of your strength breakpoints. It's also going to be dependent on exactly how many masteries you're taking throughout the tree as well. Like in my current setup, I'm only losing 2 strength to make that change, so I do think it is actually worth it to do that. But if I were to change out some gear and get closer to the next breakpoint, get closer to 1760 strength, you know, it might be worth it to look around and see, can I get the +5 strength per allocated mastery skill, and instead of being at like 1758 strength, get over 1761 strength, and now suddenly I have another 8 million DPS or whatever. Just to quickly mention the ascendancies that I'm going with, I'm using Undeniable. I think that's the first thing I took while leveling. Unstoppable, that's also a personal favorite among Juggernaut. And then Unbreakable, super great as well. I think while leveling this is, you know, especially if you're doing this as like a twink leveling kind of situation where you're wearing a tabula, then Unbreakable will basically be worthless, but it is a pretty nice node once you have a good body armor. It really helps with mitigating a lot of that elemental damage, you know, converting that armor or making that armor apply to elemental damage as well is really good. And then Unflinching is just good. It makes it so you basically have permanent uptime on endurance charges like all the time. And, you know, you get 1 extra endurance charge as well, so that adds a lot of physical damage reduction. It makes it just easy to constantly maintain endurance charges, so you can justify taking Vigor, getting another endurance charge in the mix. You're up to 5, you're getting a lot of Phys DR, you're getting a lot of LE Res out of the deal. I have seen some people use Forbidden Flesh and Flame, and then either take Unrelenting to get that Chaos Res out of endurance charges, and also get, really, I think it's more about getting about 8 to 9% more LE max hit and about another 5 or so % fizz damage reduction. And so you can either use Flesh and Flame to take Unrelenting, or you could like drop Unstoppable or Unbreakable and then use Flesh and Flame to take one of those and take Unrelenting. It's something you can do. Now, I think the only thing from the Marauder tree, you know, the stuff that's not Juggernaut, that I would maybe consider taking, like if I had it available as a Flesh and Flame option, is Aspect of Carnage, just purely because it's 40% more damage. The downside, 10% more damage taken, is very bad. I wouldn't really do this, but the idea of getting well over 100 million DPS by having Aspect of Carnage does sound pretty fun. I mean, pushing pretty close to 120 million DPS if I were able to pick that up, not counting the fact that I would lose a bunch of damage by dropping the rare jewels that I would have to give up in order to get it. So yeah, you know, still probably over 100, maybe even over 110 million DPS by dropping that and taking Flesh Flame Aspect of Carnage. I don't think I would be willing to do that, but it's something you can consider doing. All right, now I'll just briefly cover my rare gear, and I guess I'll just do that in game. This helm was pretty straightforward. I did wear this when I was initially going for spell suppression gear, so it is an armor evasion base. That is what I was going with at the time. I just haven't replaced it. Basically, I just bought like a fractured suppress base, which I think now I would probably just buy a fractured resistance base instead, probably chaos res. Maybe I could use that to get out of wearing the chaos res watcher's eye. But you know, a fractured res base, and then just roll it with strength essences until I'm happy with the suffixes. Use Eldritch Currency just initially, just to like make it so that I can easily roll the prefix by making Searing Exarch dominant. Roll the prefixes until I'm happy with the life on the prefixes. Craft physical damage taken from hits as fire, and you know, just exalt if I need to, and then just roll the implicits using Eater Embers and Eldritch Ichors, and just get myself reduced mana cost of attacks. That's really valuable, along with -7 to mana cost of non-channeling skills. That makes it so your dual strike of ambidexterity is 1 mana. That's really ideal. And then a little bit of mana reservation efficiency of skills makes it so that you have like a non-zero amount of mana, even though you're running 250% auras. You're able to get that without having to take Champion of the Cause. Pretty straightforward craft on the helm, I would say. The gloves are kind of similar. Now, I would rather use essences to craft strength on this, since they can go all the way up to 58. The essence, Deafening Essence of Rage, the strength essence. But I really wanted attack speed on my glove suffix, so I bought one with a fractured strength mod. These are armor gloves, and then I just rolled them with Deafening Essences of Zeal until I was happy with the cold res suffix, and then I used Eldritch Currency to make it so that I could roll the prefixes. I did that until I was happy with the life on the prefixes. I crafted increased damage while leeching, and then Exalt slammed on some armor, and I was happy with that. And then I used Eater of Worlds Ichors. You can use the lower tier Ichors. I think like the bottom 3 or 4 tiers all give 3% increased damage per 100 strength, and then you have to use Orb of Conflict to be able to get it up to 4% increased damage per 100 strength, which would be good. That would give me about 3 to 5% more damage, but kind of expensive and tiring to do. And then you can just use lesser Eldritch Embers for getting the Searing Exarch implicit, the chance to intimidate enemies on hit. That's really valuable. That's 10% more attack damage on enemies, and with even just the lesser is 15% chance for 4 seconds. So you're going to be applying that like every, I think like 0.65 seconds or so. So you're going to have 100% uptime on that, since you're hitting so fast. As for the rings, my rings really aren't optimal. I crafted this one with the Graveyard. I was just trying to do like a fractured tier 1 stats and life ring, and that went okay, but unfortunately I got that physical attack damage leech his life dud implicit or prefix there. Kind of a bummer. And then I think this is just one that I bought. You know, I just wanted like high strength, good resistances, life, pretty much it. The ideal version of this would be to use some of the heist rings that have reduced numbers of prefixes, increased number of suffixes, and then increased suffix magnitudes, and do basically the same thing. Go for strength, go for chaos res, go for life, and definitely go for the minus mana cost of non-channeling skills. If you could zero out the mana cost of dual strike of ambidexterity, that would be ideal too. Potentially you could get away with even not running mana leash at all if you just basically didn't have any mana cost. You used like life tap support on Assassin's Mark and your Despair, and then all the rest of your mana costs were 0. Like, that would also work. And then I think finally among gear, I just want to look at jewels. And the thing with jewels is really you're just looking for like a lot of strength. Like, this is a jewel that I bought. I think it had strength and dex and strength in it and life. And I exalted on the mana reservation efficiency. This is definitely one that I bought that just had like a lot of strength on it. And increased attack speed with one-handed weapons and max life. Cool. This is one that I think I can't remember if I bought it or corrupted myself. No life on it, but like strength, attack speed. Although attack speed with swords is useless, it really needs to be attack speed with claws or attack speed while dual wielding or something. But like strength, crit chance, dual wielding, crit multi, main thing there is the corrupted blood not being applicable to you. That's definitely super valuable since we are using a bottled faith, not using a life flask. You can. I did use a life flask initially, like for a long while playing this. I only switched to the bottled faith when I really wanted to go like turn bosses into butter, basically. And then we'll look at flasks here. You have definitely a lot of options for flasks. I am using a diamond flask of the rainbow so that my resistances are over the cap. If I take them off, they are clearly under the cap. I actually did kill Uber Maven. I realized like I died on her and I realized like, oh, I'm wearing the wrong diamond flask. I was wearing one that has reduced effective curses on you. So I was below the cap when endurance charges aren't active, but you do have endurance charges. So endurance charges will get you above the cap once they're stacked up. But, you know, they can fall off during a boss, and I think that is what killed me on the Maven, maybe. So, you know, nice to get a little bit of early res out of that. Probably could just get it out of not having suppress on my helm as it is. Also using a granite flask with increased crit chance. Now, you'll notice something here that you can do is kind of like, you know, I have attack speed on a silver flask. I have armor on a quicksilver flask, crit chance on a granite flask, and Ellie res on a diamond flask. You can mix and match your suffixes on flasks. They do not need to like a granite flask with increased armor on it is substantially more expensive than a quicksilver flask with armor on it, and a diamond flask with crit chance on it is substantially more expensive than a granite flask with crit chance on it. But there is no real difference between those. The only real value of them is, you know, it increases the thing that it does, and so it's like more easy to slot into a build. But if you're just kind of mixing and matching, that totally works and is fine. I think hypothetically speaking, if I wanted to like make a little bit of a sacrifice somewhere in here, I could probably drop one of these for an amethyst flask, and that could fix chaos res. It's definitely something you could do on kind of a lower budget. But you know, if you're already to the point of having a mage blood, you probably are going to be past that point and probably just want to fix your chaos res, you know, through gear or maybe through that Watcher's Eye mod or something instead of like throwing an amethyst flask at it, since there is no other benefit to running an amethyst flask other than just straight chaos res. All right, finally, I just wanted to talk about the claw, since that was the main biggest crafted item that I have here and kind of the biggest thing in the build. So there's really two ways to craft a claw, and I will show those off here. So we'll start with a one-handed weapon, claw, and it's going to be an Imperial Claw. That is what we are looking for. So, you know, the thing is, like, what we're really looking for is tier 1 attack speed, tier 1 crit chance, and tier 1 crit multi. And as you can see, the crit mods are both 73 item level, and the attack speed is 77. So this can be basically any item level of weapon, you know, 77 plus, but it doesn't really need to be super high for the way that I crafted it. But because you are going to want this modifier right here adds this like T1 added chaos damage, that's item level 83. So you're probably going to want an item level 83, and generally speaking, that's going to be easier to get anyways. All right, so here's how I would craft this weapon in like future leagues, or if I wasn't using the necropolis league mechanic. Here's how I would go at it. I would start with a weapon that has that tier 1 chaos damage mod as a fractured mod on it, and I would start out by just like regaling it and then hitting it with zeal essences until I was happy. Basically what I'm looking for is because zeal essences can roll 28 to 30% increased attack speed instead of the 26 to 27% that you get out of the baseline. That is actually better to have zeal essences in hand. Now, Necropolis League makes it a lot easier. I'll get to that in a minute, but this is kind of the ideal version for when you don't have the insanely overpowered crafting mechanic from Necropolis. So what you're wanting to do is you're going to want to roll with these Essences of Zeal until you get one of the two crit mods as a T1 suffix, so it could be either of them. It could be T1 crit multi or T1 crit chance. Either is fine. And then what you're going to try to do is, especially, you might have more mods on there. You're going to kind of have to do some annulling, unfortunately. And what you're wanting to get basically is like 4 mods on the item. And, this can be kind of painful. You might annul off the attack speed or crit chance. I've definitely been there. Yeah, see, this could be kind of painful. So what you're wanting is this. You are wanting to get basically an empty suffix mod, like an open suffix mod, and then also room to craft a prefix. So in this case, we're going to craft suffixes cannot be changed. And then we are going to use harvest crafting and do an add remove crit and just basically hope that it adds a high level crit mod. And it did. We have triple T1 suffixes, attack speed, T1 crit, and T1 crit multi. That's fantastic. All right, so we have triple T1 attack speed and then double crit as our suffixes. That's great. And then we have suffixes can't be changed and an empty prefix. If it were the other way around, if we had just any prefix mod, then what we could do very simply is just craft suffixes can't be changed and then hit it with a scour. And that would remove that, and then we could recraft suffixes can't be changed, so we're back at this point. Now what we want to do is, we want to hit it with a Veiled Orb. Now the Wraecrafter still has Ashling Veil in instead of the way that the Veiled Orb works now, so you will use that in the tool, but in game you would just use a Veiled Orb here, and that would turn that suffixes can't be changed into a Veiled Prefix, and then we want to block, and the thing that we want to use to block is we want to use Increase Physical, and then it can be any of these. Increase physical damage, increase physical to blind, chance to bleed, chance to whatever. So we craft that, and then we unveil, and what we're going to be looking for is attacks with this weapon penetrate chaos res. That's great. And then now what we want to craft, bizarrely, but it makes sense because of Iron Will, is increased spell damage. And we just want to get that nice high value, 66% ideally. I'm sure it's going to happen any minute now. There we go. Okay. And there we go. That's a perfect finished weapon. I did have it at 30 quality, so we could throw it in the harvest bench, get increased attack speed, highest possible attack speed, and that's a gorgeous, perfect weapon. Now, the way that I did it with the Necropolis League mechanic is actually way, 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 way easier, and I made several other claws like this. And so the way I did it with the Necropolis League mechanic was basically I made Imperial claws at just like whatever item level, 83 or whatever. I made them have as much attack speed and as much crit modifier, as much increased chance of modifiers that have crit or an attack speed. Or speed, I should say. I reduced chance of getting mana, chance of getting life, chance of getting elemental, chance of getting resistance, and then I actually reduced the amount of modifiers down to 3. I did -1 explicit modifier, so I would only have 3 modifiers on the weapon. I increased the chance of getting suffixes, and let's see, what else? Basically, it looked something like this. These aren't the exact numbers by any stretch. I'm clicking the wrong area here. Okay, increased crit, increased speed, increased chance for suffixes, -1 explicit, bunch of mod tiers so that everything would roll as tier 1, reduced chance of mana, reduced chance of physical, reduced chance of resistance, reduced chance of elemental, minus life, minus mana. And then I made it so that I would fracture 3 modifiers with the goal of getting attack speed, crit, and global crit multi as my 3 fractures on my 3 mod items. And then I also crafted multiple at a time. And I actually got lucky and I got 3 of them. Like all 3 of these weapons that I crafted at the same time all came out exactly as I wanted. I tried doing some other stuff where I would have that chaos damage prefix, that T1 chaos damage prefix as one of my fractured mods, and I just never could pull it off. I was very unlucky with that, and it is really hard to do. I just kept getting this modifier here instead, chance to damage, or chance to poison on hit, increased damage with poison. I kept getting that instead because it has a very high weight, and this chaos damage prefix has a very low weight. So because of that, the way that I've crafted it in this league is, we'll show it off here. We'll start with the Imperial Claw here, and this is going to be like 83 item level. Again, I did set it to 30 quality as well. I did go high quality. from the necropolis mods, and what we're looking for here is just like T1 crit multi, T1 crit chance, and T1 attack speed, and then those are all fractured, which made this really easy to craft. I think I literally did this in like one essence. I just slapped envy essences on until I was like happy with that. Basically just slap an envy essence on and then just like throw any crafted mod on. And then this is the bad part. Then you have to slap a veiled orb on and hope it doesn't hit the chaos damage mod, which it did in this case, but I got lucky and it didn't on my first shot. But yeah, you know, it might be very expensive going this way if you're unlucky, but hopefully you're not. And then you just block with a physical damage, and then you unveil, attacks with this weapon penetrate, chaos resistance, and then spell damage craft. Very, very basic. T1 spell damage though. And so as you can see, this is very similar to the way that you would craft a lightning strike weapon. Very, very, very similar to the way you would craft a lightning strike weapon, basically all the way up until you unveil. You know, obviously for the lightning strike weapon, you're not using a chaos damage, you're using like a lightning damage fractured prefix in the standard crafting setup, and I would be using lightning damage, I guess one of those wrath essences, and I would be penetrating elemental resistances instead of chaos. And then the main thing for lightning strike weapon is because we're not playing a jug, we're not having infinite accuracy, I would do hits can't be evaded instead of the spell damage. But other than that, very, very similar crafting process. All right, I think that finally covers gear. Now I'm going to just talk about some of the build disabling mods for this build, and thankfully there aren't really that many, but the ones that do mess you up really just like they're awful. So cannot leech, that's obviously like a non-starter, can't do that at all. I think less recovery rate of life and energy shield, because we don't have instant leech, that basically functions the exact same. Like losing out on leech really, really hamstrings you. And so I don't like that at all. We are using determination and purity of elements to like fix our elemental resistances. So reduced effective non-curse auras is really, really bad. Minus max all res is pretty bad. You know, we're getting kind of double dipping on our chaos res from eternal damnation. So like having all of that be dropped by another 10-15% is pretty brutal. I don't really want anything to do with that. And then again, we are using determination, so we are like an armor-based build, so less armor for players is really bad. And then I would say like reduced extra damage from crits is not horrible for players, but it's pretty annoying. Less accuracy rating is kind of in the same boat. They're just both very annoying. Having monsters that are basically crit damage immune is like, it sucks. Other than that, you're basically able to do pretty much the majority of map mods. Now, tier 17 map mods are a nightmare. Don't even get me started on these bad boys. I would say probably the biggest ones that really frustrate me are like, you know, all the usuals. You are able to do petrification statues. Like, they don't do anything because you are on a jug. Less defenses, obviously that's a huge problem. Penetrating elemental resistances, I did try playing around with that. That was also pretty terrible. So, yeah, you know, pretty much the standard fare for tier 17 maps. As for Pantheon, you can play around with whatever you like, but I definitely like Soul of Shikari. That really works well with Eternal Damnation, cutting your chaos resistance, having a little bit more cover for your chaos damage taken is good. Making it so that you're not getting shredded by poisons is really, really valuable for covering up the big weakness that Eternal Damnation causes. And then Soul of Lunaris is pretty standard for the majority of content. You can do Soul of Solaris if you want for bosses. You can do Soul of Arcali if you really like it. That's fine. We're obviously killing all the bandits. And then for leveling, you know, like I said before, I think that you can do this as a Bone Shatter build. I leveled it as a Smite setup, so I came down here, did the standard Smite setup that I've talked about before, made a video about before even, taking Precise Technique and Utmost Swiftness and using One with Nothing, Cluster Jewel, you know, pretty standard leveling setup. It was very, very smooth. I really, really love leveling as the Juggernaut. Undeniable is just so fun. Unstoppable is super good. They're both really, really good for just making you level very smoothly, quickly, painlessly. Really, really loved the leveling process. And what else can I say? This is a really fun build. I've really enjoyed it. I Definitely see a version of the future in which I play like a Bone Shatter Juggernaut at the start of a league and transition into this. I don't, it's going to be pretty hard for any build to replace Toxic Rain for me, but I do think this is like one of a few potential candidates that could maybe get in there and be pretty competitive. Definitely is something that I would recommend to other people to play. This build has been a lot of fun for me, much more so than I had expected or maybe even hoped. All right, I think that pretty much covers it. Thanks for watching. Bye.